A 5-year-old boy didn't disappear. He never left the house. His scent stopped at the trunk of his parents' car. And the people begging the world to help find him already knew exactly where he was. On the morning of April 18, 2019, a 911 call came into the Crystal Lake Police Department. A father reported his 5-year-old son missing. The boy had been put to bed the night before. By morning, he was gone. There were no signs of forced entry. No open doors. No open windows. No indication that anyone had broken in. Within minutes, officers were dispatched to a quiet home on Dole Avenue in Crystal Lake, Illinois. The caller identified himself as AJ Freund Sr. He told the dispatcher that his 5-year-old son, AJ, was missing. He said he last saw the boy around 9:30 the previous night when he put him to bed. AJ had been wearing a blue Mario long-sleeve sweatshirt and black sweatpants. When morning came and AJ wasn't there, Drew said he searched everywhere. Closets. The basement. The garage. He walked to the nearby park. He checked the gas station where they sometimes bought treats. He even spoke to staff at a nearby school. No one had seen AJ. When officers arrived at the home, Drew repeated the same story in person. Inside the house was AJ's mother, Joanne Cunningham. She told police she had woken up around 7 that morning, taken a shower, and applied makeup. When Drew asked if she had seen AJ, she said she hadn't. They searched together. Then they called police. This is the case of Andrew AJ Freund Jr. What began as a missing child report would soon expose something far darker, a pattern of neglect, abuse, and failures that had followed AJ for his entire life. If cases like this remind you why justice matters, consider subscribing to Cold Case Beacon. We bring light to the stories that deserve to be told, the victims who deserve to be remembered, and the failures that must never be repeated. Officers asked permission to search the home. The moment they stepped through the side door into the kitchen, they were hit with a stale, musty odor. The subfloor was exposed. Counters were buried under piles of debris. The ceiling had a hole in it with visible water damage. A faint smell of urine mixed with the overwhelming scent of neglect. The lead detective on scene that morning was Detective Edward Smith, a 23-year veteran of the Crystal Lake Police Department. He had worked missing children cases before. He had walked through homes that told stories of poverty, of struggle, of parents doing their best with limited resources. But this was different. The moment he crossed the threshold, his instincts told him this was not a case of a child wandering off. This was something else entirely. Smith moved slowly through the kitchen, his eyes cataloging every detail. The food left out on counters. The smell that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The way debris had accumulated to the point where walking through the space required careful navigation. He had seen neglect before, but the systematic nature of this decay suggested something more deliberate. Something more sinister. The dining room was cluttered with random shoes and burnt papers. In the family room, storage benches lined the walls, their doors covered in streaks, smudges, and what appeared to be dog scratches. Toys and furniture blocked access to many of the compartments. A dog sat in a cage with liquid pooled beneath it, impossible to tell if it was urine or water. The basement was worse. Officers described it in one word: filth. The floor was sticky and dirty. Bags were thrown everywhere. There were mouse droppings scattered throughout. Cockroaches scurried across surfaces. Fly tape hung from the ceiling. A small mattress sat among piles of garbage. Officers had to dig through bags and debris searching for any sign of the missing boy. Upstairs, the bathroom was filthy. The tub had visible damage and a plunger sitting inside it. An extension hose was attached to the shower head. The bedrooms were in disarray. One belonged to Joanne. Another to Drew. And then there was AJ's room. On the outside of AJ's door, officers found a chain lock with a padlock attached. There was also a slide bolt. Both were on the outside of the door, designed to lock someone in, not out. Detective Smith stood before that door for a long moment before opening it. In his career, he had learned that certain details tell you everything you need to know about a situation. Locks on the outside of a child's bedroom door were one of those details. Inside the room, officers found a makeshift bed, a crib that had been converted. The windows had screws driven into the frames and metal hooks installed to prevent them from being opened. A padlock secured the closet from the outside. A small toilet sat in the corner of the room. This was where a 5-year-old boy had been kept. Within hours, word spread through Crystal Lake that a child was missing. Sarah Mitchell was folding laundry in her living room when the alert came through on her phone. She had never met AJ Freund, but she had a 5-year-old son of her own. She couldn't imagine not knowing where he was. She couldn't imagine the terror of that uncertainty. Without hesitation, she grabbed her jacket and headed to the staging area where volunteers were gathering. By mid-afternoon, more than 100 people had assembled at Veteran Acres Park. Some were parents. Some were retirees with time to give. Some were teenagers who had seen the alert on social media and wanted to help. They were divided into search teams, given sections of the city to cover, and sent out with photos of AJ printed on hastily made flyers. Sarah's team was assigned to search the residential area west of Dole Avenue. They walked slowly through neighborhoods, checking behind sheds, looking into parked cars, calling AJ's name into backyards and alleyways. The April air was cool, and Sarah found herself wondering if AJ was cold, wherever he was. If he was scared. If he was calling for his mother. As the hours passed, the initial energy of the search began to give way to something heavier. A quiet dread that no one wanted to acknowledge but everyone felt. They had searched parks and playgrounds. They had knocked on doors and checked with business owners. They had combed through wooded areas and walked the banks of Crystal Lake itself. There had been no sign of him. No clothing. No footprints. Nothing. By evening, when Sarah returned to the staging area, she saw the exhaustion on the faces of other volunteers. She saw parents holding their own children a little tighter. She saw the police officers conferring in low voices, their expressions grim. And she knew, even if she didn't want to admit it, that the chances of finding AJ alive were diminishing with every passing hour. But what Sarah Mitchell didn't know, what none of the volunteers searching through the cold April evening knew, was that AJ wasn't lost. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't wandering through the woods calling for help. AJ was already dead. And the parents who stood before news cameras pleading for his return knew exactly where his body was. Officers searched nearly 1,000 acres of land. They scanned the waters of Crystal Lake with sonar. Drones flew overhead. Missing child posters were hung on trees downtown. The community came together, desperate to find AJ. But as the search continued, investigators began to notice inconsistencies. Cadaver dogs were brought to the property. The handler, a woman named Rebecca Torres, had been training and working with cadaver dogs for 15 years. Her dog, a German shepherd named Ranger, had been certified in human remains detection and had worked dozens of cases across Illinois. Rebecca knew how to read Ranger's behavior. She knew the difference between a casual interest and a trained alert. And when Ranger entered the Freund home on the afternoon of April 19, his behavior told her everything she needed to know. Ranger tracked a scent through the house, moving with purpose from room to room. His nose worked the air and the ground, following something invisible to human perception but unmistakable to his trained senses. The scent led him through the living areas, past the kitchen, and ultimately to the garage. There, at the trunk of the family's car, Ranger sat. It was his trained alert. The signal that he had detected the scent of human decomposition. Rebecca's heart sank. She had hoped, as everyone had hoped, that this would be a case of a child wandering off and getting lost. That they would find AJ cold and scared but alive. But Ranger's alert at the trunk meant something else entirely. It meant that at some point, AJ's body had been in that trunk. It meant this was no longer a missing child case. It was a recovery operation. The scent trail was significant for another reason. Ranger had tracked AJ's scent inside the home but not outside. There was no trail leading away from the house. No indication that AJ had walked out the door or climbed through a window. The scent began inside and ended at the trunk. This told investigators that AJ had not left the house on his own. He had been carried. And he had been placed in that trunk after he was already dead. Detective Smith received the cadaver dog report with a heavy sense of inevitability. He had suspected from the moment he saw those locks on AJ's bedroom door that this case would not end well. But suspicion and confirmation are different things. Confirmation meant they were no longer searching for a lost child. They were building a homicide case. Police began to look more closely at the parents. Drew Freund appeared cooperative. He spoke with investigators for hours. He held a brief press conference outside the home, pleading for AJ to come home, insisting the boy was not in trouble. His performance was convincing to those who didn't know what investigators had already found. But to Detective Smith, who had sat across from Drew in the interrogation room, who had watched his body language and listened to his story, there were cracks in the facade. Joanne Cunningham also spoke to the media, though more briefly. She stood outside the house, 7 months pregnant, holding photos of her son. Her attorney, George Keelys, did most of the talking. He said Joanne had cooperated with police extensively but had stopped answering questions once it became clear she was being considered a suspect. Neighbors began to share what they knew. Janelle Butler lived 3 houses down from the Freunds on Dole Avenue. She had moved to the neighborhood in early 2017 and had been immediately struck by the condition of the Freund home. The grass was overgrown. The exterior was in disrepair. There were times when she could hear yelling coming from inside, though she could never make out the words. The first time Janelle met AJ was Halloween 2017. She was sitting on her porch handing out candy when she saw a small boy walking up her driveway. He was wrapped in white gauze from head to toe, and for a moment, Janelle thought it was an incredibly realistic mummy costume. She complimented the effort. But then Joanne, who was standing behind AJ, told her it wasn't a costume. AJ had been at the hospital all day. He had grabbed a pot of boiling water off the stove and poured it over himself. The gauze covering his body was medical, not decorative. He had lost patches of hair. His skin underneath was burned. Janelle felt her stomach turn. She looked at this small child, barely 4 years old, wrapped in bandages and still being taken trick-or-treating as though nothing was wrong. She didn't know what to say. She gave him extra candy and watched as he walked back down the driveway with his mother. In the months that followed, Janelle saw AJ occasionally. She saw him playing in the yard, though always alone, never with other children. She saw him getting into the car with his parents. And she saw the bruises. On his arms. On his legs. On his face. She took photos when she could, zooming in with her phone camera to document what she was seeing. And she called the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. She called more than once. Another neighbor, Michael Chen, lived directly across the street from the Freunds. He worked from home and often saw the comings and goings of the household. He noticed that the children were rarely outside. He noticed that when they were outside, they seemed subdued, quiet in a way that children usually aren't. He noticed the police cars that seemed to show up at the house with disturbing regularity. And he noticed something else. There were nights when he would hear screaming. Not the playful screaming of children running around. Not the frustrated yelling of parents at their wits' end. This was different. This was the sound of fear. Michael had called the police once, about a year before AJ disappeared. He told them he was concerned about the children in the house across the street. He told them about the screaming. An officer had gone to the house. Michael watched from his window as the officer spoke with Drew at the door. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. The officer left. Nothing changed. Now, as Michael watched the police search his neighborhood, as he saw the news vans parked on his street and the volunteers walking past his house calling AJ's name, he felt a deep sense of guilt. He wondered if he should have done more. Called more often. Been more insistent. But the truth was, he had called. Janelle Butler had called. Other neighbors had called. They had all seen the signs. They had all tried to intervene. And the system that was supposed to protect AJ had failed him. The involvement of DCFS was not new to this family. In fact, DCFS had been involved with AJ's family since the day he was born. On October 16, 2013, Joanne Cunningham gave birth to a baby boy at Centegra Hospital in McHenry, Illinois. The delivery itself was unremarkable. But when hospital staff performed routine drug testing on the newborn, they found opiates in his system. The baby, who would be named Andrew Freund Jr., was born addicted to the drugs his mother had been using throughout her pregnancy. An investigation into neglect against Joanne was opened immediately. DCFS caseworkers interviewed her while she was still in the hospital. She admitted to using heroin during her pregnancy. She said she wanted to get clean. She said she wanted to be a good mother. But her actions and her words existed in different realities. Less than a month later, on November 7, 2013, AJ was taken into protective custody. At 3 weeks old, he was removed from his mother's care and placed with a foster family. The foster mother, a woman named Patricia who had been fostering children for over a decade, took one look at the tiny infant and felt her heart break. He was so small. So fragile. Born into a world that had already failed him. AJ remained with Patricia for a year and a half. During that time, she watched him grow and develop. She watched him learn to roll over, to sit up, to crawl. She watched him take his first steps in her living room, his face lit up with pride and excitement. She watched him learn to say his first words. Mama. Dada. Dog. Ball. She watched him become a person. Patricia loved AJ. She knew that foster care was meant to be temporary, that the goal was always reunification with biological parents when possible. But she had seen enough cases to know that sometimes reunification wasn't what was best for the child. And as the months passed and she attended supervised visits between AJ and his biological parents, she grew increasingly concerned about what would happen when he was returned to them. During those supervised visits, Patricia noticed things. She noticed how Joanne's attention would wander. How she would be focused on AJ one moment and then seem to forget he was there the next. She noticed how Drew would grow frustrated when AJ cried, his jaw clenching, his voice growing sharp. She noticed that neither parent seemed to know how to play with their son. How to engage with him. How to read his needs. But Patricia also noticed that Joanne could be charming. That she knew what to say to caseworkers and supervisors. That she could perform the role of a mother trying to get her life together. And Patricia watched, powerless, as the system decided that performance was enough. In June of 2015, when AJ was 19 months old, he was returned to his biological parents. Patricia packed his things with tears in her eyes. She held him one last time, breathing in the baby smell of his hair, memorizing the weight of him in her arms. She told him she loved him. She told him to be good. And then she handed him to Joanne and watched them drive away. DCFS closed the case less than a year later, in May of 2016. According to their records, Joanne had completed substance abuse treatment. The home had been deemed suitable. The family was stable. AJ was safe. But AJ was not safe. Teachers at AJ's preschool began noticing concerning signs within months of his return home. His teacher, Linda Morrison, had been working with young children for 20 years. She knew what normal childhood injuries looked like. A scraped knee from falling on the playground. A bump on the head from running into a shelf. Those were accidents, and they happened. But the marks she saw on AJ were different. There were bruises on his arms that looked like grip marks. Bruises on his back in places where children don't typically injure themselves playing. There was a day when AJ came to school with a bruise on his face, dark purple and yellowing at the edges, clearly several days old. When Linda asked him what happened, AJ looked down at his shoes and said he fell. But the bruise didn't look like it came from a fall. Linda documented what she saw. She took notes. She filed reports with DCFS. And like Janelle Butler, like Michael Chen, like the police officers who had been called to the house multiple times, she waited for someone to do something. For the system to intervene. For AJ to be protected. But the reports were marked as unfounded. Caseworkers visited the home and saw nothing that warranted removal. Joanne had explanations for the bruises. The dog had knocked him over. He had fallen off his bike. He was clumsy, always running into things. And the caseworkers, overworked and managing dozens of cases each, accepted those explanations and moved on. The medical records told their own story. Between 2016 and 2019, AJ was taken to the emergency room multiple times. There was the boiling water incident on Halloween 2017, when AJ suffered second-degree burns over significant portions of his body. The official explanation was that he had grabbed the pot handle and pulled it down on himself. But emergency room staff noted in their records that the burn pattern was unusual. That it looked more consistent with water being poured over the child rather than splashed. There were visits for bruises, for cuts, for mysterious injuries that Joanne attributed to rough play or accidents. Each time, hospital staff documented their concerns. Each time, they filed reports. Each time, DCFS investigated and found the allegations unfounded. In the fall of 2018, AJ's older brother told a school counselor that their mother had hit AJ with a belt. The counselor immediately reported this to DCFS. A caseworker named Carlos Acosta was assigned to investigate. He visited the home on multiple occasions. He interviewed the parents. He observed the children. And in his final report, he concluded that there was no credible evidence of abuse. What Carlos Acosta failed to do was talk to the neighbors. Failed to review the pattern of emergency room visits. Failed to look closely enough at the home environment to see what was really happening behind closed doors. He saw what Joanne and Drew wanted him to see. A struggling family trying their best. Parents who loved their children but were dealing with behavioral issues and unfortunate accidents. In December of 2018, just 4 months before AJ would die, there was another investigation. This time, the allegations involved cuts, welts, and bruises on AJ's body. Police were called to the home on December 18 to arrest Joanne for driving with a suspended license. While there, an officer noted that the home was not acceptable for children. Dog feces and urine were found throughout. The officer observed a large bruise on AJ's right hip. Joanne said it must have been from the dog. The next day, AJ was examined by a doctor at Santegra Hospital. The doctor grew concerned when AJ said, "Maybe someone hit me with a belt. Maybe mommy didn't mean to hurt me." The way he phrased it, the uncertainty in his voice, the need to excuse his mother's behavior even while acknowledging it, was heartbreaking. The doctor documented everything and filed a report. A DCFS investigator visited the home on December 19. This investigator reported that no feces or urine was observed on the floor. The home was cluttered but not dangerously so. Drew denied any corporal punishment. He denied that Joanne was using drugs. He presented as a concerned father dealing with a difficult situation. 2 weeks later, on January 4, 2019, DCFS concluded their investigation. They found no credible evidence of cuts, welts, or bruises. The case was closed. AJ was left in the home. And the countdown to his death continued. As the search for AJ entered its second day, investigators turned their attention to digital evidence. They obtained consent to search Drew Freund's cell phone. The forensic team that processed the phone worked through the night, extracting data, recovering deleted files, and building a timeline of Drew's digital activity in the days before and after AJ was reported missing. The Digital Forensics Unit was led by specialist James Park, who had been analyzing cell phone data for law enforcement for 8 years. He had seen everything from drug trafficking operations coordinated through encrypted apps to evidence of murders planned in text messages. But as he worked through Drew Freund's phone, even he found himself disturbed by what he was uncovering. The first significant finding was a Google search conducted at 3:47 a.m. on April 15, 2019. 3 days before AJ was reported missing. The search query was simple: child CPR. On its own, this might not have been damning. Parents Google medical information all the time. But combined with the timeline of what was about to be uncovered, it took on a much darker significance. James continued working through the phone. He recovered deleted photos. He examined location data. He pulled up browsing history. And on April 17, 2 days after that CPR search and 1 day before AJ would be reported missing, he found a photo that made his blood run cold. It was a picture of a shopping list. The handwriting was casual, the kind of quick note someone makes when they're trying to remember what to pick up at the store. But the items on that list told a very specific story. Duct tape. Plastic gloves. Air freshener. Bleach. These were not the typical items on a family's grocery list. These were the items someone would need if they were trying to clean up evidence of a crime. If they were trying to cover up a death. James cross-referenced the photo timestamp with financial records. He pulled up credit card statements and bank records. And sure enough, on April 17, there were purchases at a Jewel grocery store that matched the items on that list. Duct tape. Plastic gloves. Air freshener. Bleach. Drew Freund had photographed the list and then bought every item on it. Inside the home, when investigators conducted a more thorough search, they found laundry that smelled strongly of bleach. Not the normal smell of clothes washed with bleach as a whitening agent. This was different. This was the overwhelming, chemical smell of items that had been soaked in bleach. Items that someone had tried very hard to sanitize. They found at least 4 bottles of bleach in the house, some of them empty, some partially full. For a family that claimed to use bleach regularly for cleaning, the sheer quantity was notable. But it was the smell of those clothes, the way the bleach scent overpowered everything else, that told investigators this was about more than routine cleaning. Drew's gym shoes were found with wet mud still clinging to them. The mud was fresh, suggesting recent outdoor activity. When investigators tested the composition of that mud and compared it to soil samples from around Crystal Lake, they would later discover that it matched the soil from a specific area in Woodstock, Illinois. The area where AJ's body would eventually be found. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from the text messages between Drew and Joanne. James Park spent hours reading through their communications, building a timeline of their relationship, their discussions about their children, their day-to-day lives. And what he found in the messages sent after AJ's death was chilling in its mundanity. On April 16, 2 days before AJ was reported missing and 1 day after he had died, Drew texted Joanne asking how she and the boys were doing. He said he hoped they were all outside playing. It was a normal text, the kind of message a father might send from work checking in on his family. But AJ was already dead when that message was sent. Already wrapped in plastic in the basement. Joanne responded that they were doing well and to keep praying. She asked Drew to research OD psychiatrists, churches, etc. She said they could do this, especially with help. She felt they had pinpointed what was happening with the little guy. The implication in the message was that AJ was alive and presenting behavioral challenges that needed professional intervention. But AJ was not alive. This was all performance. All pretense. Later that day, Drew asked how her day had been. Joanne said it was good. She told him they were dyeing Easter eggs. Easter was coming up, just a few days away, and she wanted to make it special for the boys. She said she would try to put the boys down for a nap so she could put together their Easter baskets. She mentioned she had bought supplies on clearance the previous Easter season and still had them in the closet. Drew told her to go ahead with the baskets and he would look at them when he got home that night. The casualness of it was jarring. They were discussing Easter baskets while AJ's body was decomposing in their basement. They were talking about family activities and holiday celebrations as though everything was normal. As though they hadn't just killed their son. Later that evening, Joanne texted Drew to say that AJ had ended up in his room because he had lied repetitively about breaking a cup. She said she had watched him around the corner. He took the cup, looked at it, and smashed it on the ground. Drew replied that they really needed to get that figured out. He said AJ was a good kid but his lying was simply unacceptable. But AJ hadn't broken a cup. AJ hadn't lied. AJ was dead. This entire exchange was fiction. They were creating a narrative, building a false history of the day that would explain why, when they finally reported AJ missing, he might have run away or hidden somewhere. They were setting up their alibi. Joanne agreed with Drew's assessment. She said after reading what she had read that day, she realized AJ's behavior had turned into something far worse than oppositional defiant disorder. She couldn't remember what it was called but said she had it written down. She said they were doing everything right with him, but it was out of their hands. They couldn't fix him or help him. They needed professional help. She continued, saying that everything they were doing was the right way and it still wasn't working. She said it had taken them a long time to figure out what to do and what not to do. She said people were sometimes just born that way and there was only a very slight possibility he could change as an adult. She asked Drew to help her with research because she couldn't do it all herself. Drew agreed. He said they would figure it out with God's help. He told her to keep praying and researching. The invocation of God in these messages, the presentation of themselves as loving parents struggling with a difficult child, was a level of manipulation that disturbed even experienced investigators. They were not just covering up a crime. They were constructing an entire false reality. The next day, April 17th, Joanne texted Drew asking if they could get a TV at the pawn store for both bedrooms so the boys and she could watch movies in bed. She asked if he had gotten a chance to grocery shop for milk that morning. Drew said he hadn't. He apologized, saying he was so tired he could barely remember what he had done that morning. Joanne said it was okay. They would have to make do tonight because there was no more milk. She said the boys had been so good that day, minus a couple of mishaps. She told them they could sleep with one of the parents that night and they were excited. She said AJ had helped her clean the entire house and everything. She called him such a charmer when he was good. She said there had been lots of hugs that day. Drew responded that it was good to hear. AJ had not helped clean the house. AJ had not been charming. AJ had not hugged anyone. AJ was in a tote in the basement, and Drew was preparing to bury him. On April 18th, the day AJ was reported missing, Joanne texted Drew asking him to check the gas station. She said it was the only other place she could think of that AJ would know. She asked him to please ask them. She said she had looked everywhere again in the house and told AJ that if he came out, he wouldn't get in trouble. Shortly after, she texted again asking for the key to the other car because it had died and she couldn't open the trunk. She said she doubted AJ would be in there but it didn't hurt to look. Then she asked if Drew knew where the basement key was. She said she had looked there 15 times but wanted to check again. All of these messages were sent after AJ was already dead. After his body had already been removed from the house and buried in Woodstock. They were creating a timeline of searching, of worry, of parental concern. They were performing the role of frightened parents for an audience that would eventually read these messages. Before investigators could confront Drew and Joanne with the evidence they had gathered, they needed to understand who these people were. What had led them to this point? What circumstances and choices had resulted in the death of a 5-year-old boy? Joanne Cunningham was 36 years old when AJ died. She had grown up in the Chicago area, the product of what court documents would later describe as a troubled childhood. Her own parents had struggled with addiction. She had experienced abuse and neglect. She had learned early that the world was not a safe place, that people who were supposed to love you could hurt you, that survival sometimes meant becoming someone you never wanted to be. Joanne's first documented drug use was in her early teens. By her 20s, she was addicted to heroin. She had multiple arrests for theft, for drug possession, for writing bad checks. She had children with different men. She lost custody of those children. And with each loss, with each failure, she seemed to sink deeper into addiction and chaos. By all accounts, Joanne could be charming when she wanted to be. She knew how to present well to authority figures. She knew what to say to caseworkers and judges. She knew how to cry at the right moments and express remorse in ways that sounded genuine. But beneath that performance was someone who had never learned how to be a parent. Who had never developed the capacity to put a child's needs before her own. Who saw her children not as people to be loved and nurtured but as extensions of herself, as possessions to be controlled. Andrew Freund Sr. was 32 years old when AJ died. Like Joanne, he had a history of run-ins with law enforcement. Theft. Domestic violence. Drug-related offenses. He and Joanne had met in their 20s and had formed a toxic partnership built on mutual addiction and dysfunction. Drew presented himself differently than Joanne. Where she could be openly emotional, he was more controlled. More measured. He spoke calmly to investigators. He answered questions without obvious signs of distress. But those who knew him told a different story. Neighbors described him as quick to anger. As someone who you could hear yelling through the walls. As someone who intimidated not through size but through an undercurrent of barely restrained violence. Together, Drew and Joanne created an environment of chaos. Their relationship was marked by cycles of violence, separation, and reconciliation. Police had been called to their home more than a dozen times between 2012 and 2019. There were reports of domestic violence, with each of them at various times being both perpetrator and victim. There were reports of drug use, of neglected children, of neighbors concerned about what was happening behind those closed doors. The house on Dole Avenue had been their residence for several years. It was a rental property, and according to the landlord, they had stopped paying rent consistently about 18 months before AJ's death. The landlord had tried to work with them, had tried to be understanding, but the condition of the property had deteriorated to the point where it was becoming a liability. There had been discussions about eviction. But those discussions had not yet resulted in action. And so the family remained in that house, in conditions that grew worse with each passing month. City officials had received complaints about the property. About the overgrown grass. About the visible exterior damage. About possible code violations. But in a city with limited resources and many properties needing attention, the house on Dole Avenue was not considered a priority. It was not condemned. It was not declared uninhabitable. The family was allowed to remain. Extended family members had grown increasingly distant from Joanne and Drew over the years. Joanne's own mother had tried to intervene multiple times, had offered to take the children, had pleaded with Joanne to get help. But Joanne had cut off contact, had moved frequently, had made it difficult for family members to know where she was or how to reach her. Drew's family told a similar story. They had tried to help. They had offered support. But Drew and Joanne operated in a closed system, suspicious of outsiders, protective of their ability to live without interference. And in that closed system, with no one allowed close enough to see the full truth, AJ suffered. On the night of April 23, 2019, 5 days after AJ had been reported missing, Detective Smith and his team brought Drew and Joanne into the police station. They were separated, each placed in different interrogation rooms. They had been told they were being brought in to discuss the investigation, to go over some details. But both of them knew, on some level, that this was the end. The interrogation room where Drew sat was small and bare. A table. A few chairs. A mirror that he knew was one-way glass. He had been in interrogation rooms before. He knew how this worked. And as Detective Smith entered the room and sat down across from him, Drew tried to maintain his composure. Tried to continue the performance he and Joanne had been maintaining for days. Smith didn't start with accusations. He started with empathy. He talked about how difficult this must be. How worried Drew must be about his son. How the whole community was praying for AJ's safe return. He built rapport slowly, creating a space where Drew might feel comfortable enough to tell the truth. But Smith also had the evidence. He had the phone records. The text messages. The Google searches. The shopping list. The receipts. The cadaver dog alerts. The timeline that showed clearly that something had happened to AJ days before he was reported missing. And as the interrogation continued, as Smith methodically presented piece after piece of evidence, Drew's story began to fall apart. It started with small inconsistencies. Times that didn't match up. Details that changed from one telling to the next. Smith would circle back to earlier statements, pointing out contradictions, asking Drew to explain. And with each contradiction, with each moment where Drew had to choose between continuing the lie or acknowledging the truth, the performance became harder to maintain. In the other interrogation room, Joanne was going through a similar process. The officer questioning her, Detective Linda Morrison, took a different approach. Where Smith was methodical and analytical, Morrison was more emotional. She talked about being a mother herself. About how she couldn't imagine what Joanne was going through. But she also talked about how lying to protect herself was only going to make things worse. How the truth, however painful, was the only way forward. Joanne cried. She said she didn't know what had happened. She said she had been a good mother. She said AJ was difficult, that he had problems, that they had tried so hard. But Morrison kept pressing. Kept presenting evidence. Kept pointing out that the story Joanne was telling didn't match the facts. It was after midnight when Drew finally broke. He had been in that interrogation room for over 5 hours. He was exhausted. The weight of what he and Joanne had done was crushing him. And when Detective Smith asked him one more time what had really happened to AJ, Drew put his head in his hands and began to confess. He admitted that on April 15, AJ had lied about soiled underwear. Drew said they had tried everything with AJ. Timeouts didn't work. Taking away privileges didn't work. Nothing seemed to get through to him. And on that night, when AJ lied again, Joanne had decided that a cold shower was the appropriate consequence. She had placed AJ in the shower. She had turned on only the cold water. And she had kept him there for approximately 20 minutes while AJ cried and begged to be let out. But Joanne wanted to teach him a lesson. She wanted him to understand that lying had consequences. And so she kept him in that freezing water, ignoring his pleas, while Drew stayed downstairs, not intervening, not stopping what was happening. But the cold shower wasn't the only thing that happened that night. According to Drew's confession, at some point during or after the shower, Joanne had struck AJ. She had used the shower head, the metal extension that was attached to the tub, and she had hit him with it. Multiple times. In the head. She had been angry. She had been frustrated. And she had lost control. After the beating, AJ had been put to bed. Drew said they thought he was just tired. That he would sleep it off. That maybe they had been too harsh, but the punishment was over now and things would go back to normal in the morning. But morning didn't bring normal. Morning brought silence. And when Joanne checked on AJ, she found him cold and still in his bed. Drew said the next day, when he came home and Joanne told him that AJ was dead, he panicked. He didn't know what to do. He knew they would be blamed. He knew that everything they had been through with DCFS, all the investigations and suspicions, would come crashing down on them. And so he made the decision to hide what had happened. He took AJ's body to the basement. He wrapped him in plastic bags. He stored him in a tote, the kind of storage container people use for seasonal decorations or extra clothing. And he left him there while he and Joanne figured out what to do next. On April 17, 2 days after AJ had died, Drew took the tote containing his son's body and placed it in the trunk of his car. He drove to Woodstock, to a rural area he knew from his childhood. It was farmland, remote, the kind of place where you could be alone without worrying about being seen. He found a spot near some trees. He dug a shallow grave. And he buried his son. He covered the grave with straw, trying to disguise the disturbed earth. And then he drove home, stopped at a gas station to wash his hands, and returned to the house where Joanne was waiting. The next day, they would report AJ missing. They would call 911. They would speak to the media. They would search the neighborhood. They would play the role of terrified parents. And they almost got away with it. In the early morning hours of April 24, investigators, along with the FBI, traveled to the location Drew had described. It was a remote parcel of farmland in Woodstock, about 30 minutes from Crystal Lake. The property was owned by someone Drew had known years ago. He had played there as a child. He knew the land. He knew where someone could dig without being easily discovered. The sun had not yet risen when the team arrived. They brought shovels, forensic equipment, lights, and cadaver dogs. The location Drew had described was near a line of trees at the edge of a field. There was fresh straw scattered over an area of disturbed earth. It was exactly as Drew had said it would be. Using shovels and working carefully to preserve any evidence, investigators began to dig. The grave was shallow, only about 2 feet deep. Within minutes, they encountered the plastic bags. And inside those bags, wrapped in layer after layer of black plastic, was the body of a small child. The investigator who first saw AJ's face through the plastic felt his throat tighten. He had been doing this job for 15 years. He had recovered bodies before. But there was something about a child, about the smallness of the form, about the tragedy of a life barely begun and already ended, that hit differently. He stepped back and let the forensic team take over. AJ's body was carefully removed from the grave. Photographs were taken. Evidence was collected. And then he was transported to the McHenry County Coroner's Office, where Dr. Michael Thompson would perform the autopsy that would reveal the full extent of what had been done to him. At a press conference later that morning, Crystal Lake Police Chief Jim Black addressed the media. The press room was packed with reporters, cameras, and community members who had been following the case since AJ was first reported missing. Chief Black's voice was heavy with emotion as he confirmed that the body believed to be AJ had been recovered. He said investigators had interviewed both Joanne Cunningham and Andrew Freund Sr. overnight. Once presented with the evidence, both had provided information that led to the recovery of the body. He said the cause of death was unknown at that time and would be determined by the McHenry County Coroner's Office. He announced that both parents were in custody and had been charged. Joanne Cunningham was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of aggravated battery, 2 counts of aggravated domestic battery, and 1 count of failure to report a missing child or child death. Andrew Freund Sr. was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated battery, 1 count of aggravated domestic battery, 2 counts of concealment of a homicidal death, and 1 count of failure to report a missing child or child death. Chief Black addressed AJ's family directly. He said it was his hope that they might have some solace in knowing that AJ was no longer suffering and his killers had been brought to justice. Then, speaking to AJ, he said, "We know you're at peace playing in heaven's playground and are happy you no longer have to suffer." The autopsy performed by Dr. Michael Thompson revealed injuries that spoke to prolonged and systematic abuse. Dr. Thompson had been a forensic pathologist for over 20 years. He had examined thousands of bodies. He had seen the aftermath of violence in all its forms. But the injuries inflicted on AJ Freund were among the most extensive he had documented in a child abuse case. On the front of AJ's face were numerous abrasions. Some were small and circular, approximately the size of a penny. Others were irregular, linear, suggesting they were made by an object with ridges or texture. Dr. Thompson photographed each injury and then compared them to evidence collected from the house. When he placed images of the metal showerhead found in the upstairs bathroom next to images of the circular abrasions on AJ's face, the match was unmistakable. The showerhead had been used as a weapon. There were multiple red abrasions and a blue-purple contusion above AJ's left ear. The abrasions extended from his forehead along the side of his head to the back of his skull. These injuries indicated that AJ had been struck repeatedly, from multiple angles, with significant force. Dr. Thompson estimated that AJ had been hit at least a dozen times, though the true number was likely much higher. Many of the injuries overlapped, making it difficult to determine an exact count. He said it could have been dozens of blows. On the right side of AJ's face, there were additional bruises and contusions along the jawline. AJ's arms and legs were covered in bruises and abrasions at various stages of healing. Some were fresh, sustained in the final assault. Others were days old, weeks old, evidence of previous abuse that had never been reported or investigated. An old fracture was found on AJ's first rib. The presence of a callus indicated that the fracture had been healing for some time, at least several weeks. First rib fractures in children are rare and typically result from severe trauma. They are often seen in cases of child abuse. This injury would have been painful. It would have made it difficult for AJ to breathe deeply. And yet, no one had taken him to a doctor. No one had sought treatment. Both of AJ's lungs showed what pathologists call leopard spots, small hemorrhages scattered throughout the lung tissue. This is an indication of inhaled blood, meaning that AJ had been bleeding internally and aspirating his own blood into his lungs. His brain had swollen significantly in the hours after the beating. The medical term for this is cerebral edema. The swelling was so severe that the brain had begun to crush itself against the skull. Human brains are housed in a rigid structure. When swelling occurs, there is nowhere for the brain to expand. The pressure builds. Vital structures in the brainstem, which control breathing and heart rate, become compressed. With nowhere else to go, the pressure causes those vital functions to shut down. Breathing becomes irregular, then stops. The heart struggles, then stops. Death follows. Dr. Thompson was asked during his testimony if this would have been a painful death. He paused before answering. He explained that while AJ was being injured, while he was being struck repeatedly in the head, he would have been in severe pain. The fear and terror of being attacked by his own mother would have been overwhelming. But once the brain swelling reached a critical point and he lost consciousness, he would no longer have felt anything. The suffering that led to that point, however, was very real and very prolonged. At trial, the full horror of AJ's final days was laid out for the jury. The prosecution presented evidence systematically, building a timeline of abuse, neglect, and ultimately murder. They called witnesses who had seen AJ's bruises, who had reported their concerns, who had tried to intervene. They presented the text messages between Drew and Joanne, showing the jury how the couple had created a false narrative even as AJ's body lay dead in their basement. But perhaps the most disturbing piece of evidence was a video recording found on Joanne's phone. It had been taken several months before AJ's death. In the video, Joanne could be heard interrogating AJ about something he had allegedly taken. Her voice was harsh, accusatory, dripping with contempt. AJ's voice, by contrast, was small, frightened, desperate to please. "Why did you take it?" Joanne demanded. "I didn't, Mommy," AJ said. His voice was shaking. "You're lying to me," Joanne said. "You're always lying. Why do you lie?" "I'm not lying, Mommy. I promise." "You are lying. You took it and you're trying to hurt me. You want me to get in trouble. You wish evil on this family." "No, Mommy. I love you. I love you. You don't act like you love me. You don't show it." The video went on for several minutes. Joanne's interrogation became more intense. AJ's responses became more desperate. He said he was sorry. He said he would be good. He said he loved his family. But nothing he said was enough. Joanne continued to berate him, to accuse him, to tell him that he was the problem, that his behavior was destroying the family. When the video was played in court, several jurors were visibly upset. One woman put her hand over her mouth. A man in the back row wiped his eyes. This was not a recording of normal parental discipline. This was psychological torture. This was a child being told that his existence was a burden, that his presence brought evil into the home, that he was fundamentally bad and unlovable. And this was just one video. Investigators believed there were likely many more interactions like this that were never recorded. The prosecution called Dr. Sarah Henning, a child psychologist who specialized in abuse cases, to explain the psychological impact of this kind of treatment. Dr. Henning testified that children who are subjected to constant criticism, who are told they are inherently bad, who are blamed for problems they didn't cause, develop what psychologists call a negative core belief. They begin to believe that they truly are bad, that they deserve punishment, that they are the cause of their own suffering. This belief, Dr. Henning explained, makes it even harder for abused children to seek help. They don't tell teachers or friends what's happening at home because they believe they deserve it. They don't report the abuse because they think they are the problem. And in cases like AJ's, where the abuse was combined with physical isolation, the locks on his door, the limited contact with the outside world, the child becomes trapped in a reality defined entirely by the abuser. The defense attempted to argue that Joanne had not intended to kill AJ. That the death was accidental. That she had been trying to discipline a difficult child and things had gotten out of control. They presented evidence of Joanne's own traumatic childhood, her struggles with addiction, her mental health issues. They argued that she was a product of her own abuse, that she had never learned healthy parenting, that she deserved compassion. The prosecution countered by pointing out that many people experience childhood trauma and do not go on to abuse their own children. That addiction and mental illness, while they may explain behavior, do not excuse it. That Joanne had multiple opportunities to seek help, to place her children in safer environments, to choose differently. And instead, she had chosen to isolate, to hide, to continue the cycle of abuse until it ended in murder. Drew's defense took a different approach. They argued that he had not been present during the final assault on AJ. That he had not struck the child. That while he may have failed to protect AJ, he had not actively killed him. They portrayed him as someone who was under Joanne's influence, who was afraid to intervene, who made terrible decisions in the aftermath but was not the primary perpetrator. The prosecution presented evidence that Drew had been a willing participant in the cover-up. That he had buried his son's body. That he had helped create the false timeline. That he had stood before cameras and begged for information about AJ's whereabouts while knowing exactly where his body was. They argued that even if Drew had not struck the fatal blows, his actions afterward made him equally culpable. The trial lasted several weeks. Witnesses testified about what they had seen, what they had reported, what they had feared. Medical experts explained AJ's injuries in clinical detail. Digital forensics specialists walked the jury through the evidence found on phones and computers. And through it all, Drew and Joanne sat at separate defense tables, no longer united, each trying to minimize their own responsibility. When the time came for sentencing, Joanne Cunningham was given the opportunity to address the court. She stood, her hands shaking, and spoke for several minutes. She said AJ was smart, brilliant, handsome, funny, loving, and absolutely loved. She said his favorite donut was chocolate with sprinkles. His favorite color was green. His favorite food was all food because he loved to eat everything. His favorite toys were Legos. She said her heart and mind were consumed with despair, pain, sadness, grief, and extreme remorse. She spoke about her own struggles. She said she had always felt abandoned, unloved, insignificant, forgotten, and rejected. She said she had been mentally and physically abused without a single moment of encouragement. She said her needs were enormous and her strength had dried up. She said she had become a stranger to herself. She blamed drugs for being a band-aid, something to take her pain away. She said she was living proof of what mental and physical abuse could create in someone. She asked for compassion, love, and mercy. She said her heart and mind had failed her and her loved ones. She said she could not go back and change that. And then she sat down, tears streaming down her face, and waited for the judge to respond. Judge Robert Wilbrandt looked at Joanne for a long moment before speaking. When he did, his voice was firm and without sympathy. He said the evidence showed that Joanne had repeatedly struck her son on the head with a metal shower sprinkler, taken him out of the shower while he was still alive, locked him alone in his room, and left him to die from blunt force trauma. He said it was a horrible death preceded by a horrible life. The judge acknowledged Joanne's history of drug abuse and mental health issues. He noted that she had been addicted to heroin, Adderall, and various other illegal substances for years, including when AJ was in her custody. He said AJ was born with heroin in his system. He said Joanne had sought treatment several times but each time lapsed back into what he described as drug-addled filth. He said that while her own trauma was real, it did not excuse what she had done to her son. Judge Wilbrandt said that Joanne had been given chance after chance. DCFS had tried to work with her. The courts had given her opportunities to prove she could parent safely. And at every turn, she had failed. But more than failing, she had actively harmed the child who depended on her most. She had beaten him. She had locked him in his room. She had psychologically tormented him. And finally, she had killed him. Joanne Cunningham was sentenced to 35 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. With good behavior, she would be eligible for parole in her late 60s. But the judge made it clear that he hoped she would serve every day of that sentence. AJ Freund Sr. was sentenced separately. He was given 11 years for aggravated battery to a child, 14 years for involuntary manslaughter, and 5 years for concealment of a homicidal death. The sentences were ordered to run consecutively, for a total of 30 years. He was also required to register under the Violent Offender Against Youth Registration Act. At his sentencing, Drew spoke briefly. He said he was sorry. He said he had made terrible mistakes. He said he wished he could go back and make different choices. But Judge Wilbrandt, who also presided over Drew's sentencing, said that remorse was meaningless without action. And Drew had had many opportunities to take action, to protect his son, to report the abuse, to seek help. Instead, he had enabled the abuse, participated in the cover-up, and buried his child in a shallow grave. But the failures in this case extended far beyond the parents. The system that was supposed to protect AJ had failed at every level. And one person who represented that systemic failure was held accountable. Carlos Acosta, the DCFS caseworker assigned to AJ's case in late 2018, was charged with child endangerment and reckless conduct. The charges stemmed from his failure to properly investigate reports of abuse. Despite clear evidence of neglect, despite police reports documenting horrific living conditions, despite a doctor's concerns about injuries, Acosta had closed the case and deemed the allegations unfounded. The prosecution in Acosta's case argued that he had not done his job. That he had failed to interview key witnesses. That he had accepted the parents' explanations without conducting a thorough investigation. That he had prioritized closing cases quickly over ensuring children's safety. They presented evidence that Acosta had visited the home but had not looked closely enough. That he had spoken to Drew and Joanne but had not questioned their account. That he had documented concerns in his notes but had not followed up on those concerns. Acosta's defense argued that he was overworked and under-resourced. That DCFS caseworkers in Illinois carried impossibly high caseloads. That the system was broken and he was being scapegoated for systemic failures. They presented evidence that Acosta was managing over 50 cases at the time he was assigned to AJ's family. That he was working 60-hour weeks trying to keep up with reports and investigations. That he was doing his best in an impossible situation. The jury deliberated for less than a day. In October of 2020, Carlos Acosta was found guilty of child endangerment and reckless conduct. At his sentencing, he told the court he was not the lazy, uncaring monster he had been portrayed to be. He said not a day went by that he did not feel regret and remorse over the loss of AJ. He said he had dedicated his career to protecting children and this one failure would haunt him for the rest of his life. Judge Will Brandt, who also presided over Acosta's sentencing, said there was no evidence that Acosta was overworked or didn't have time to investigate the case. He said the evidence showed that Acosta had had adequate time and resources to do his job properly. He said it was not about being overwhelmed. It was about being careless. It was about taking shortcuts. It was about failing to see what was right in front of him. Carlos Acosta was sentenced to 6 months in the McHenry County Jail and 3 years of probation. The conviction of a DCFS caseworker was unprecedented in Illinois. It sent shockwaves through the child welfare system. Some saw it as justice, as accountability for a system that had failed too many children. Others saw it as unfair, as punishing an individual for systemic problems that were far beyond his control. In the aftermath of AJ's death, Illinois DCFS came under intense scrutiny. A comprehensive review of the department's handling of AJ's case revealed multiple failures at multiple levels. Caseworkers had not followed protocol. Supervisors had not provided adequate oversight. The system for tracking and investigating reports was inadequate. The training for caseworkers was insufficient. The resources available to the department were stretched too thin. Illinois legislators proposed reforms. There were calls for lower caseloads for caseworkers. Better training. More funding. Stricter protocols for investigating reports of abuse. Some of these reforms were implemented. Caseload caps were established. Training programs were expanded. Additional funding was allocated. But advocates argued that the changes didn't go far enough. That the system remained fundamentally broken. That without more substantial reforms, there would be more children like AJ who fell through the cracks. As of today, both Joanne Cunningham and Andrew Freund Sr. remain incarcerated. Joanne is serving her sentence at Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois. Drew is serving his sentence at Pontiac Correctional Center in Pontiac, Illinois. Neither has expressed significant remorse beyond what they stated at their sentencing hearings. Neither has provided additional information about the extent of AJ's abuse or suffering. AJ's older brother, who was 6 years old at the time of AJ's death, was removed from the home and placed in foster care. He has since been adopted by a family who, by all accounts, loves him and is providing him with the stability and safety he never had with his biological parents. His identity is protected, and information about his current life is rightfully kept private. But those who have worked with him say he is resilient, that he is healing, that he has a chance at the kind of life AJ never got to experience. Patricia, AJ's former foster mother, attended the sentencing hearing. She sat in the back of the courtroom and listened as the judge described the injuries inflicted on the little boy she had loved. She heard about the locked room, the cold shower, the beating with the shower head. And she thought about the toddler who had taken his first steps in her living room, who had laughed when she tickled his belly, who had held her hand when he was scared. She thought about the day she had handed him back to his biological parents, the day she had watched them drive away, and she wondered if there was anything she could have done differently. After the sentencing, Patricia gave an interview to a local news station. She said she wanted people to know who AJ really was. Not just a victim. Not just a statistic. But a real child who loved Legos and chocolate donuts, who had a beautiful smile, who deserved so much better than what he got. She said that foster parents need more support, that the system needs to do more to keep children safe, that reunification shouldn't be the goal when it means returning a child to danger. The case of AJ Freund is a story of systemic failure at every level. It is a story of warning signs ignored, reports dismissed, and a child left in the hands of those who were supposed to protect him. From the moment he was born with opiates in his system, AJ's life was marked by neglect and abuse. He spent the first year and a half of his life in foster care, only to be returned to a home that was never safe. DCFS was involved for his entire life. Police were called to the home more than a dozen times. Neighbors reported concerns. Doctors raised alarms. Teachers filed reports. And yet, AJ remained in that house. He remained in that room with the locks on the outside and the windows screwed shut. He remained with parents who saw him not as a child to be loved, but as a problem to be punished. On April 15, 2019, after being placed in a cold shower for 20 minutes and beaten repeatedly in the head with a metal shower head, AJ died. He was 5 years old. His parents buried him in a shallow grave and pretended to search for him. They sent text messages about Easter baskets and family prayers. They spoke to the media. They played the role of devastated parents. But the truth was already written in the evidence they left behind. AJ Freund was failed by every system designed to protect him. He was failed by his parents. He was failed by DCFS. He was failed by a system that saw the warning signs and did nothing. His life was short, painful, and filled with suffering. But his story has not been forgotten. In the years since his death, AJ's case has been cited in discussions about child welfare reform. It has been used as an example of why the system needs to change. Why caseworkers need smaller caseloads. Why reports of abuse need to be taken more seriously. Why the safety of children must be the priority, even when it means keeping families separated. Some changes have been made. Illinois now requires more frequent visits to homes where abuse has been reported. Caseworkers receive additional training on recognizing signs of abuse. There are stricter protocols for investigating reports. But advocates say it's not enough. That children are still falling through the cracks. That the system is still broken. And they point to cases like AJ's as proof that more needs to be done. If you are reading AJ's story and you suspect a child is being abused, please report it. Call the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. Call your local Child Protective Services. Call the police. Don't assume someone else will make the call. Don't assume that because you're not certain, it's not worth reporting. It is always worth reporting. Because somewhere, there is a child like AJ who is waiting for someone to see, to speak up, to intervene. And that someone might be you. This is Cold Case Beacon, where we shine a light on the cases that demand to be remembered. If you believe stories like AJ's need to be told, if you believe justice matters even when it comes too late, then subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Share this video so others can learn what happened to AJ Freund. And stay with us as we continue to bring you the cases that refuse to stay silent. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering AJ.